Good morning. It's a sunny day here in Kampung Penchala because today we are driving the new MG-S5 EV. And this is not some ridiculous preview drive. We have this car for 2 days and we're going to be driving from here in KL all the way out to Kuantan. And so we'll be able to figure out how this car is like to drive on the open road, what the efficiency is like, and we'll even be able to sample charging. So, without further ado, now, I've been driving this MG-S5 for a couple of days now. The intro that you just saw was shot yesterday, but because there was a lot to do, I didn't really have a lot of time to shoot yesterday. So the MG-S5 is a car that we've covered before. We covered it at the launch, and this car effectively replaces the MG ZS in the lineup as the new sort of entry-level electric crossover from MG. Now, interestingly, the MG ZS remains on sale for as long as stocks last. There aren't that many of them left, and they are available for a very good rebate. And so if you're looking for something like that, it might be a good deal. But ultimately, when that car exhausts itself of stock, this is what's going to be left. Now, the MG S5 EV is built off of the same scalable product architecture that we saw from the MG4, which is why this car uses similar battery packs, similar motors, and that's why it also provides similar output, and that's also why this is the only B-segment electric SUV that is rear-wheel driven with the single motor mounted over the rear axle. As a result, this gives, according to MG at least, a certain dynamic difference when driving this car compared to the majority of its competitors. Now, speaking of competitors, the MG S5 arrives in the market having to go head-to-head with a couple of pretty major names. The first, of course, being the PROTON eMAS 7, which comes in and tops out about 119,000 ringgit. And then, of course, there's the BYD Atto 3 Ultra, which is about 125,000 ringgit before available rebates and so on. And, of course, the MG S5 is a little bit more expensive than that. In fact, the model that we're in now, which is the Lux Long Range, comes in at about 137,000 ringgit or something to that effect. So, of course, the first question that a lot of people will be asking is, why would I pay more money for a car within the same segment? If I could get an eMAS 7 or an Atto 3, why should I bother considering the MG S5? Well, firstly, for that premium, you are getting a slightly better built interior. The interior of the MG S5, funnily enough, feels a lot more conventional compared to a lot of other EVs now. So, for example, while we still have a large central touchscreen, which manages the majority of the controls in this car, there are still physical touch controls for this car, such as the HVAC panel underneath, which allows you to adjust the temperature and your fan speed and your volume and stuff like that, as well as physical controls on the steering wheel to, again, control the majority of your functions. And so this has a clear focus towards a better experience for the driver. And this speaks to the fact that MG has a little bit more heritage than other brands, and SAIC, the parent company that owns MG, also has a little bit more history when it comes to developing cars for a slightly more traditionalist buyer. On top of that, in addition to the physical controls, the quality in here in terms of materials is also pretty good. So, for example, on the door cards, you get nice soft touch materials up here, more soft touch materials down here, lots of stitching about the place. The dash top is incredibly soft, and in between that there's lots of use of interesting textures such as perforated leather, even here on the steering wheel, as well as this carbon fiber-like effect on certain panels in order to break up the visual monotony of the cabin. And all of this works very well to this car's favor because it makes this interior again feel like a more upmarket experience, especially compared to the BYD Atto 3, and it's certainly a little bit more visually interesting than what we've seen from the PROTON eMAS 7, which some people have accused of being a little bit sparse. But one of the things that has sort of taken me aback within this cabin is actually the ergonomics, because being sat in this seat, I've done about 500, 600 kilometers going to and from Kuantan in this car yesterday and today, and I've got no backache. Everything, all the controls are very easy to reach. I've never had to sort of look around and try and figure out how to do things. Everything works exactly the way you expect it to. And because, for example, the steering wheel is now adjustable for reach and rake, unlike the MG ZS where it was only rake adjustable, it also means that, again, finding a comfortable driving position is a lot easier. And although the passenger seat in this car, even in this Lux Long Range, is not powered, the very least, the driver's seat, however, does have lumbar support. It is a manual lumbar support. It's got a lever on the side of the thing, and sure, an electric electric lumbar would have been a little bit better, but at least it's there. Unlike the Atto 3, which doesn't offer lumbar, unlike the eMAS 7, which also doesn't offer lumbar. So this is at least some degree of improvement. And talking about the seats themselves, the material quality of the seats are also something that I think is worth discussing. Because firstly, these are not fully leather or faux leather upholstery. Instead, you've got faux leather upholstery around the side, and then you have high quality fabric in the middle with a little strip of more perforated faux leather with MG badging sort of perforated into it in order to, again, make this car feel a little bit more upmarket, a little bit more premium. And all of that with this lovely grey interior plus the full-size panoramic sunroof, all of this just adds to a really upmarket sensation the moment you get into the cabin. Now, there are two more points I'd like to touch on. Firstly is what this car's like to drive over a longer distance, since we've had the opportunity to do that. And the second, obviously, and the other thing, obviously, is driving dynamics. So I want to touch on dynamics first. Now, MG claims that this is the most dynamically capable vehicle within its segment, largely down to the fact that, obviously, this product architecture, the platform upon which this car is built, has been designed in order to accommodate slightly more driver-focused vehicles, such as the MG4 and also, by extension, the MG Cyberster. And, of course, the fact this car is rear-wheel driven also should, in theory, create a slightly more engaging driving experience. Now, from behind the wheel, because the front wheels are only dealing with steering and not motive force, I will admit that this steering wheel is a little bit more communicative than what you get from the eMAS 7, and certainly miles better than what you get from the Atto 3. But one of the things I appreciate most of all in this car is the fact that the steering wheel is very naturally weighted. At no point does it feel like it's overly assisted, like it's too light, and neither does it feel artificially heavy, like a lot of cars like to do in order to give you some semblance of sporty driving. And as a result, it means that as a driver, I do feel quite confident as I input steering into this car, and before the car naturally responds to those inputs. Now, that works especially well together, or in concert rather, with this car's suspension. Now, the suspension tuning on this car is notably firmer than what you get from the Atto 3, and also a little bit firmer than what you get from the eMAS 7. However, it's not just a matter of making this car feel stiff. Clearly, the engineers at MG have an idea of what they're doing, because this car is certainly not uncomfortable in the slightest. However, the rebound rate has been very, very well calibrated in this car in order to provide better body control. Now, just to make this very clear, this car doesn't drive with the same sort of alacrity that you get out of, say, an MG Cyberster. In fact, I would argue that the MG4 X-Power is probably slightly better to drive than this, if you were to drive them back to back. However, given the fact that this is ultimately a family SUV, or something that will be utilized as a family SUV, the fact that it maintains body control as well as it does means that if you were to take on a longer drive, like I have, you tend to experience a lot less motion sickness within the car, which is also great if you have children in the car, or if you have elderly parents, for example. And it also means that when you're cruising at higher speed, as a driver and also as a passenger, you feel a lot more confident in the car, because it feels like the car never really gets out of your control, so to speak. Now, when you are also driving on the motorway at higher speed, you also pay attention to this car's refinement. Now, in terms of road noise and wind noise, it is surprisingly well suppressed, at least within this price point. And I do think this car is slightly quieter than the BYD Atto 3 or the PROTON eMAS 7 for that matter, when driven at speed. However, that's where we get into energy efficiency, which unfortunately is a point that is perhaps slightly less than stellar. Now, this car utilizes the same powertrain system as we've seen from the MG4, which was a car that in X-Drive or X-Power form, as we drove it, we felt that that car consumed far too much power, but then again, it's also a 300 horsepower hatchback. In this, with 170 PS, we expected to see numbers very similar to what you'd see from a Proton eMAS 7, which means that when driven on motorway at motorway speeds over a sustained high-speed drive, I was expecting to see about 15 to 16 kilowatt hours to the 100. Unfortunately, this car is presently returning about 18.7. Now, based on my testing with this car, having done almost 600 kilometers, the combined average since I left KL to Kuantan and came back is about 18.6, which is, again, slightly less than stellar. However, that should mean that this car will be able to do a little bit over 300 kilometers on a single charge, which is respectable, but perhaps slightly less than ideal. However, driven about in town, I'm slightly more confident this car will be able to achieve its 425 kilometer WLTP range, because when driven about at reasonable speeds, the consumption also becomes or reduces itself to a slightly more reasonable level. Now, the last point I'd like to touch on, because I'm almost at my destination, is safety. Now, the MG S5 EV comes as standard with ADAS functions all the way through the lineup, which is even if you get the base, I think it's called the Comfort model, you still get the same ADAS functionality, which is absolutely fantastic because it means that this car is better set up for people who are looking for a slightly more entry-level type affair, who don't want to spend too much money, or who want a vehicle like this to use primarily in town. And the ADAS functionalities on this car have been tailored and adjusted in a way that feels very natural. And so again, this is a system that you can trust, that you can rely on, that is something that is a lot more reliable and dependable on a day-to-day basis, and that is again exactly what you want from a vehicle like this, particularly something that's being used as a family hauler. So all things considered, as I pull into the car park and end this very long journey, so what does that mean about the MG S5 EV? Now, I think that, of course, we need to test this car a little bit further because obviously we need to test a few more daily type affairs. Is this more efficient in town, for example, if driven on a day-to-day affair through traffic jams and so on and so forth? And then, of course, we do want to test out the practicality of this car a little bit more because obviously we've only had 2 people in the car with our luggage in it, and it's been all right, but there are lots of other areas that we'd like to touch on. So I wouldn't recommend this car just yet, but I certainly think that it's worth a test drive if you are buying within this segment. It's also worth pointing out the MG S5 EV currently comes with a 7-year warranty as standard for the vehicle itself, as well as an 8-year warranty on the high voltage powertrain, which means that this is a car that should keep you pretty safe. Now, be sure to stay tuned because we will take this car out on a full test at some point, and when we do, there is a lot more for us to uncover. But in any case, that concludes our media drive preview of the new MG S5 EV. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, hit the little bell icon to notified every time we make a new upload. Don't forget to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. All the links are in the description below, including the link to join our new WhatsApp channel. Thank you so much for watching. We'll catch you in the next one. Take care and stay safe.